Okay, we'll get underway. I'd like to welcome everybody tonight to this Fabian Society event. High noon or crunch time, I can't remember which one it is, for the TPPA. I've just been reading in the Washington Post this morning that Elizabeth Warren in the States has come out, Senator Elizabeth Warren, against the TPPA, as have the nurses in America. So the movement is building here and in New Zealand. And so it's my great pleasure to welcome tonight to address some of the issues that are involved in the Trans-Pacific Partnership to Jane Kelsey, Professor at the University of Auckland, well known to many of you, to Simon Terry from Sustainability New Zealand, to Hayden Green from the Consumer New Zealand, and Dr. Gay Keating, who was a signatory to the letter to the Lancet raising concerns by about 27, I think, clinicians raising concerns about the medical consequences of the potential agreement. So tonight, Jane will start off, then Simon, then Hayden, then Gay, and then back to Jane, and then there will be time for questions and discussion. Okay, so thank you very much, Jane. The floor is yours.
Kia ora koutou. I'm not in good voice tonight, so you're going to have me in 2 bites. I'm joking with people that I've become allergic to the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement after 5 years. It's 5 years this month that the negotiations have been going. 5 long years. Can I first get an assessment? How many of you are TPPA virgins? Everyone knows something, do you? Anyone who's a beginner? Don't be shy. Okay. Okay. What I want to do is to paint a bit of the big picture and where the negotiations are at now, and why there is currently a sense of urgency around what is happening, and then pass over to Simon, who's going to do, especially around some of the investment issues, and Hayden, who's going to talk about some of the IP issues, and Gay, who'll talk about the meds issues. And then I'm just going to say a few things about what is being done within Aotearoa and what kinds of things people can do over the next 10 weeks to 3 months. 5 years is actually not that long a time in terms of negotiating these kinds of mega agreements. Those of you who've been following the World Trade Organization Doha round will know that that was launched in 2001. And it's had a number of stalls along the way, and it's currently stalled again. And part of the reason for that, along with some of the other very ambitious agreements, is that these agreements now have an incredibly broad scope. Right? Very little to do with the old-fashioned trade issues of slabs of butter and sheep carcasses and motor vehicles going across the border and tariffs and so on. An awful lot of that has already been dealt to, and that which hasn't been dealt to is the super sensitive stuff that the governments that have the big economies, which others want to lower those barriers, are simply for domestic reasons not willing to do. So instead we've got a much more focused objective about integrating the structures of rules across countries that facilitate, especially the bigger corporations, being able to operate relatively seamlessly wherever they are. So that means money being able to flow easily across borders, it means protection of their intellectual property and monopoly rights over that intellectual property, it means having reasonably harmonised standards, for example food standards and labelling across countries, means protections for foreign investors when they go and invest in countries, to face minimal constraints and regulations, and to be able to take action if governments do things that impede their commercial interests and their future profitability. Increasingly, we're also seeing in the mega agreements a focus on not just what the rules are, but what the criteria and underlying principles of rules are. Now, in this country, we're very familiar now with light-handed regulation. Right? We had leaky buildings, we had finance company collapses, we had Pike River, we had the RENA, we had aged care home issues and so on, that are about what is called risk-tolerant, light-handed regulation, with the consumer being the buyer beware. That kind of regulatory objective is now a driving element in the big agreements that are being negotiated internationally. In addition to what the principles or orientation of government policy and rules should be, there are new rules being introduced about who has the right to participate in decisions about making new laws and policies. In particular, notions, quaintly, those who know about the secrecy of these negotiations, called transparency, but transparency for the big commercial interests that may be affected by the decisions of governments, and about their rights to have input into the decision-making processes of governments. So it's not just about what the rules are, it's about what the rules aim to do, what the processes are that you must use to reach your rules, and who has the right of input into that decision-making process. Both states, foreign states, and foreign corporations. That these are quite different new generation kind of agreements, and when they describe the likes of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement as a 21st century agreement that goes further behind the border to put disciplines on governments, that's what they mean. To lock in the kind of neoliberal framework that we have been used to here since the 1980s. Now, of course, we know, especially since the global financial crisis, that that model is in some state of crisis itself. And there is a lot of rethinking that is taking place. One of the important elements of these agreements is designed to lock governments into that model and to create opportunities for challenging any attempt to move outside that model or into a new kind of post-neoliberal paradigm. And we need to see that bigger picture when we're listening to the more specific kind of examples. The really bad news is that the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement is one of three agreements currently being negotiated that are these mega agreements. And there is a parallel negotiation between the US and the EU. They've all got four-letter acronyms, right? Well, Trans-Pacific Partnership's three, but we give it four, because we call it an agreement, because it's not a partnership. So we've got the TPPA between the 12 countries, Canada, US, Mexico, Peru, Chile, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Malaysia, Brunei, Vietnam, and Japan. Hello, Phil. And then we have another mega agreement between the US and the EU, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP. And then we have another one, those of you who are familiar with the GATS, we have, forgive me, the bastard child of GATS, called TISA, the Trade and Services Agreement. And that is being negotiated at present. New Zealand is a party to that because they couldn't get what they wanted to in the Doha round negotiations on services in the World Trade Organization. So we have a new agreement amongst like-minded countries who literally call themselves the really good friends of services. And New Zealand is a party to TPPA and TISA. The US is a party to all three. And so what we've got happening is this development of prototype ideal rules for the 21st century across those agreements, and they will cross-fertilise. We as lawyers have this kind of rule called most favoured nation. The best treatment you give one country, you have to give all the rest. Well, when it crosses those kind of mega agreements, you end up with a mix and match that allows what you can't get in one to be gained in another. So that means that even if the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement doesn't come off, there's two others going at present, and we have our finger in one of those pies. However, despite what a number of people think about 5 years and therefore it's never going to happen, the reason for the title of today's talk, or today's meeting, is that we really are at a crunch point. There was scheduled to be a meeting of ministers from the 13th to the 15th of March where they were going to make the final decisions and the trade-offs. That's been deferred for a month until the middle of April. Why has it been deferred? Well, the bad news is it's not been deferred because all the things that people here are going to talk about are not ready for political decisions. Virtually all of the 29 chapters in the agreement have been boiled down to a short list of checkpoints where ministers will choose for biologics, medicines, data exclusivity, 0 years, 5 years, 8 years, or 12 years. And so the choices around many of the non-traditional trade issues are clearly there for the ministers to make. What is holding it up is that there are two elephants in the room, the US and Japan. And ironically, it's the old-fashioned trade issues that have been holding up the agreement between them, without which the decisions on the other issues will not take place. What is holding the US-Japan deal up? Well, the easy answer is that the US wants Japan to open its agriculture markets and to reduce its rules on automobile emissions. So they've got very tight rules around emissions for vehicles that the big gas-guzzling US ones can't meet, and so on. And that there are tensions there, and they have not been able to reach a bridge between the US agribusiness and auto demands and the sensitivities in Japan. That is true, it's part of the story. But there is another part of the story that is really important, and it's why we need to think of this not as a trade agreement, but as a rules-making agreement. Those of you who know anything about Japanese politics, and I know there's some in the room who do, the Abe government, which is in power now, is a bit like our 1984 Labour government, in that the Prime Minister Abe describes his economic policies as Abenomics. And it has 3 arrows. One of those arrows is reform of the agriculture sector. So in a sense, they're quite happy with the US demands, although they're going to cause political discomfort if they push them too far down. At the same time, they have a monetary policy goal. And that monetary policy goal has been influencing Japan's exchange rate. And it means that Japan is, if you look at Japan and US relations, Japan is in a much better position vis-a-vis the US. The US can't export as much into Japan as it could before because of the shifts in the exchange rate. And the US Congress is extremely unhappy about this. And they are demanding that, as part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, there must be what they call disciplines on currency manipulation. Now, those disciplines, it's a bit like being in a parlour of some sort, are intended to whip the Abe government into submission. But whereas the Abe government is actually quite happy to make changes on agriculture, although it will cause some political pain, the currency issue hits at its core economic policy. And to make those changes that the Congress is demanding is actually a step too far. So we're having an interesting little standoff there, that it's not actually just about old-fashioned trade issues anymore. The US Congress has overreached its demands that has put the backs of the Japanese up even further. And the Japanese are especially concerned about how the US might make these demands. And this is the thing I want us to think about, how it might be used here as well. There is in US trade negotiations something that we call the dirty little secret. When governments enter into treaties, the treaties come into force when they swap the diplomatic notes that says we've complied, we agree now that this agreement will come into force. The US will not send that letter until the other country has changed its laws and policies to the US understanding of what the agreement requires of that other country. And this is a process called certification. And we've done, if you want to find out about this, TPP nocertification.org has documented how the US has used this in the last 7 years. It not only imposes its interpretation of the words of an agreement. Now, anyone who's read these things, and I'm sure most of you have better things to do with your time, but lawyers have very opaque words because that's how you reach an agreement, right? It's elastic, it's vague. Well, it's the US interpretation of the vague that has to prevail, not your interpretation. But beyond that, the US has said on a number of occasions, oh, it's not in the text, but you agreed in the room you'd do this. Yeah? Or, as a condition of you joining the talks, you promised to do this. Or, in the case of Guatemala and biologics medicines, you said you wouldn't do this, but we're not going to bring the agreement into force unless you do. And so the US uses this blackmail mechanism at the end of the process to say, you really want to bring this into force? Then you do these extra things. Now, Peru is the most documented example we have, thanks to some Freedom of Information Act requests that were done in the US. Not only did the government send its draft legislation up to the US for vetting before it was introduced, the US wrote the legislation for Peru. It then sent someone down to monitor the legislative process in Peru and make sure there were no amendments which were threatened in Peru's legislature. And Peru basically surrendered its sovereign authority to make those interpretations for itself. The most recent analysis we've done about 2 months ago was the Australia-US FTA. So it's not just poor countries that this happens to. The copyright provisions in there, copyright is an issue for big US corporations, they didn't like what Australia had done in the legislation. And so they said, well, Mr. Howard, you said this agreement's going to come into force on the 1st of January. Well, it's not going to unless you pass new legislation. And this is what the legislation will say. And it needs to be passed by X date, otherwise the agreement won't come into force because we won't send the letter. And so the legislation went through the Australian Senate with a select committee process of 24 hours, with people given 3 hours notice to make submissions, with no ability to make the amendments to the legislation. And for those who follow parliamentary processes here, the Bills Digest that the Parliamentary Library prepares, they were apoplectic about this. Because it was actually a total surrender of the ability of the Australian Parliament to decide how to interpret the legislation and pass its own laws. Now, you can imagine that Japan, given the tense nature of the relationship between the US and Japan in these negotiations. It's really worried about how that will be used against it. But I can tell you that most of the chief negotiators in these negotiations are deeply concerned about thinking they will reach a final deal. Then the US Congress, having its legislative process with or without what we call fast track, and saying, well, yes or no, and we want these things and so on. And then when you think you've got a final deal, it's not a final deal until the US likes what you've done in your domestic laws. Now, some of that will be visible in terms of domestic legislation. Some of it will be less visible. Farm Acts processes, for example, doesn't require legislation in the House. Right? There are various things that will happen through regulation and through directives that we may never know. And the Official Information Act may actually make it impossible for us to know about those interactions because they have signed an agreement amongst each other that any communications relating to the negotiations of the agreement will remain confidential for 4 years beyond the agreement coming into force. Right? And so we have some in the end game, we have some very serious questions to ask about what is the implication of this, not just for specific areas, but for the fundamental questions of our sovereign right to make our own decisions. So I want to leave it at that and talk at the end just very briefly about some of the initiatives that are happening over the next few weeks and pass over to Simon.